The ruins of the magnificent civilization of ancient Greece today lies scattered, a crumbling testimony to her former glory. Her buildings and culture were the envy of the then-known world and would inspire and influence civilizations for thousands of years to come. Even today, every cornerstone of our very own democracy can find its roots in the civilization of ancient Greece. For over 2,000 years, the Acropolis has surveyed the city of Athens. The temples and sanctuaries have been stripped of some of their beautiful sculpture, their precious stones and metals, but shells of colorless stone still stand to echo her former glories. Today, Athens is the capital of a peaceful Greece, but her inhabitants are proud to remember the time when the Empire of Greece was the most powerful in the world. The remnants of the many temples and statues of ancient Greece can still be seen, many lying discarded and ruined. But can we really imagine what it must have been like to see the Acropolis in its full glory, colorful and complete? Is it really possible to recreate in our minds an image of the life-sized statue of Athena, made from solid gold and ivory, that lived inside this magnificent pantheon? We can certainly try. What was it really like to walk along the shaded colonnades?
The Greek world in the 6th century BC was divided up into a lot of independent city-states, some of them very small, little more than large villages. Some of them, even the largest, wouldn't be larger than about 100,000 population. That's about the size that Athens was in the 6th century. They were basically agricultural communities. Almost the entire population would be engaged in farming most of the time. They would be run, whatever their political system was supposed to be, in reality by members of the elite, the richest people in society. And often there would be a lot of fairly violent competition between these members of the elite that might well lead to quite a lot of people going into exile because they were unhappy with who was running their state. To the east of the Greek world, you've got a number of larger empires: Lydia, Persia, Babylon, and Egypt. And there would be quite a lot of contact between these. You get cultural ideas flowing in both directions, but in particular, the number of states in the eastern part of the Greek world would tend to pick up a lot of ideas from these ancient empires. And at the same time, you'd expect a fair amount of trade. Samos in particular seemed to have a lot of trade with Egypt in this period, and that led to quite a lot of wealth and quite a lot of interesting Egyptian goods being found in Samos.
The agora was the market square and the heart of the Greek city. In the morning, it was a frantic hubbub of traders, desperate for the best price for their goods, foreigners looking for work, and slaves shopping for their masters. Come the afternoon, the agora became a quiet place, where citizens of all ages gathered to chat and gossip. Philosophers had the chance to test their theories on a small captive audience.
It was the marketplace, it was the centre of political activity, it was also where the law courts were. It was a very crowded space. It was crowded with buildings, market halls, the law courts, and particularly symbolic places. The tholos was there. That's the particularly round building where the executive officers of the boule, the ruling council, if you like, had their meals at state expense and kept a standard set of weights and measures. So it was very much felt to be part of the central civic space of the community. At the same time as being a civic space, it was also a religious space. Particularly in Athens, the Sacred Way winds through the agora up to the Acropolis, and here the religious processions came through the city.
The staple diet for the poorer citizens was grain, corn, figs, and olives, because they were plentiful, versatile, and cheap. Meat was relatively rare on a lower-class table, but was an everyday part of the meals of the rich and the elite. The Greeks drank wine and water. The wine had a similar texture to puree, and water was added to dilute and determine its strength. The citizens of Athens at this time enjoyed a varied social life. Position in society was dependent on the number of slaves each household could afford. It was very rare that even the poorest of citizens did not own any.
Your position as a slave was really dependent entirely on your master. You could have a good master and a relatively good life, and you could have a bad master and have a miserable and probably very short life. One of the worst places to be if you were a slave was to be in the silver mines, or mining of any kind, but to be in the mines. We have evidence of the mining at Lorion in Attica, and you can see how narrow, dark, sharp and dangerous the shafts were. It was tantamount to a death sentence, really, to be sent to the mines. If you, on the other hand, if you lived in a fairly comfortable house in the city, you could have a relatively good life. Slaves are often comic heroes in comedy, so there was obviously an amount of ambivalence there. Some slaves were educated, particularly to teach other children. Slaves were educated in crafts. The Athenians in particular thought anything crafty, anything techne, was not the proper way for an Athenian citizen to earn their living. So anybody who was involved in any of sort of crafts, pot making or whatever, would be some sort of second-class citizen. Probably a free non-citizen living in the city, a metic, but could also be a slave.
For a wealthy man, an invitation to a symposium or dinner party would be received with the greatest of pleasure. These evenings would involve an enormous meal and, most importantly, entertainment. A bard would relate stories and sing about the legends and heroes of the mysterious past. This would be followed by dancing girls, who would dance, sing, and have sex with the guests. Their wives, understandably, were excluded. Women in Greece had their relative freedom. During the days, they would take care of the household, shop at the markets with their slaves, and meet friends to gossip. But the most exciting activity of the female calendar was attending the festivals of Dionysus, god of wine, drama, and merrymaking. Here they would proceed into the hills and drive themselves into a frenzy, dance and sing. Men, understandably, were excluded. Everyday scenes, especially the symposiums, were a popular depiction on the vases of Athens at the time, and these have been a comprehensive way for archaeologists to find out about the lives of the ordinary person. Clothing was fairly simple, but hairstyles changed from year to year. Men wore the traditional toga, and the women wore a chiton, or underdress, and full-length coat over the top. For the men, a shorter toga would have been worn for battle. From the evidence that has been left to us, the documented history of ancient Greece begins with the legend of the Trojan War. The date of the 10-year siege is much debated, but is generally thought to have taken place around 1200 BC. We will never really know what took place between the Trojans and the Greeks 3,000 years ago. Was the fabulously beautiful Helen a real person and the sole cause of such a devastating war? After 10 years of bitter siege, were the defenders of Troy really deceived by a ruse as simple as the infamous wooden horse? Over the long millennia, fact, fiction, and fantasy have become interwoven, so that today it is about impossible to separate the reality on which the tales are based from the mythology. The entire episode may be no more than a poetic flight of fancy. On the other hand, the siege of Troy may really have been the place where gods met men. Much of that evidence comes from Europe's most ancient literary work, Homer's masterpiece, the Iliad. Written in the 7th century BC, it throws a light upon these troubled times that were to have their bloody climax in the Trojan War, where the affairs of men collided with the games of the gods.
In Troy, there lies the scene. From isles of Greece, the princes Augulus, their high blood chafed, have to the port of Athens sent their ships, fraught with the ministers and instruments of cruel war. 69 that wore their crownets regal from the Athenian bay put forth toward Phrygia, and their vow is made to ransack Troy, within whose strongy mures the ravished Helen, Menelaus' queen, with wanton Paris sleeps. And that's a quarrel. To Tenedos they come, and the deep drawing barks do there disgorge their warlike fraughtage. Now on Dardan plains the fresh and yet unbruised Greeks do pitch their brave pavilions. Priam's 6-gated city, Dardan and Timbria, Helios, Chetas, Troyan, and Antenorides, with massy staples, uncorresponsive and fulfilling bolts, spur up the sons of Troy. Now expectation, tickling skittish spirits on one and other side, Trojan and Greek, sets all on hazard. Like or find fault, do as your pleasures are. Now good or bad, 'tis but the chance of war.
The great gulf of time, which separates the events of the siege of Troy from our modern world, means that the true story of the Trojan War will now never be known. All we have is the narrative presented by Homer in the Iliad, augmented by snatches from other literary sources and small amounts of archaeological evidence.
The ruins that Heinrich Schliemann discovered at a place called Hisarlik in Turkey were quite interesting because it was a legend of a lifetime, and to his mind he proved the legend of the Trojan War, to be correct. And he decided also that this mound, Hisarlik, was the site of Troy. He went and dug there, and it's quite incredible because he followed his hunch and he seemed to be correct. Schliemann, he dug down because he had to prove that Troy, Homer's Troy, existed. And then in a level which we now identify as Troy 2, he found gold, which he called Priam's treasure. Sad to say, it's nothing to do with the legend. What we now consider to be Troy of historic date is a little bit of an argument still amongst archaeologists, but we normally think it's a level called Troy 7A. There are the 9 levels, but they divide into A's and B's, slight differences. And this is round about 1290 BC. And if the Trojan War happened, and something certainly did happen, that's roughly when it was. That's the place where legend says it was, and Schliemann's excavations seem to have shown us that yes, indeed it was there, in modern Turkey. There's very little evidence actually on the ground for a battle having taken place, or indeed the 10-year siege of Troy. What we've got to remember is in Homer, in his Iliad, it's only the end of the siege, the 10th year. Troy had been besieged for 9 years. They came to triumph in the 10th. So obviously there was a lot of fighting backwards and forwards. Homer tells us of the chariots and such like racing round the plain of Thessalic. But this kind of thing doesn't leave much evidence. The only evidence we've got comes from the excavations initially by Heinrich Schliemann, subsequently by his assistant Dortfeld, and then by the American Carl Blagan, where on the Citadel Mound we found walls, this stratification, and there is evidence there of burning, of a city being destroyed. But in terms of actual evidence of battles, weapons and such like lying about, not the kind of thing which is left anyway. You've only got to think of a modern battlefield. All the scrap is cleared away very shortly afterwards. So evidence in terms of material aspects is a little difficult other than the actual structure in the mound itself.
Europe's oldest masterpiece, Homer's Iliad, is therefore a source of uncountable value. It tells us a great deal about Greek society at the dawn of civilization, their customs, their religious life, and how they made war. The Iliad demonstrates a united Greece, the like of which was not seen for many hundreds of years after. But, more importantly, it shows the structure of states that existed within Greece during its days of glory. Each of the Greek warring states at Troy was represented by its king, and all the kings were subject to the greatest king of them all, Agamemnon, ruler of Mycenae. His tomb still rests here, nestling in the hills of Mycenae. Its sheer magnitude is a fitting monument to such a great king. Interstate warfare was very common in ancient Greece, and in the 5th century BC, two states were becoming increasingly strong, Sparta and Athens. They were bigger than the other states, and at the beginning of the 5th century, they struck the devastating blows that drove the oppressive, tyrannical rule of the Persians out of Greece. The most famous battle to emerge from the Persian Wars was the Battle of Marathon. The weaker Greek armies won against a larger, more powerful Persian force. A Greek messenger who ran a mammoth distance for the sake of his country was the inspiration behind the 26-mile runs of modern society.
And the battle went on for hours, but nevertheless the citizens of Athens couldn't see it, and they feared the worst. And the hours passed, and then from the walls of the city, the people looked out, and they saw a lone figure running, 27 miles from the plain of Marathon. The marathon is based on it. And this man ran and ran and ran in the heat with his bits of armor on, covered in blood. And he came through the gates, and there was the government in front of him. There was the whole government of the people, and he was completely finished and done. And they looked at him and he said, "Victory." And he died. And the Athenians had defeated the Persians in the Battle of Marathon.
While the Spartans formed an effective and disciplined land army, the Athenians were always famous for their strong and efficient navy. At the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC, the Athenians destroyed the Persian navy with their sleek and highly maneuverable triremes.
We get some idea of what life was like on board Greek ships from the comic poet Aristophanes, who makes it clear that it was a fairly unpleasant experience. And from reconstructions of the Greek trireme and from other things, historians are able to confirm this. Triremes were very cramped. You had 3 rows of oarsmen, more or less, sitting on top of each other, with very little freedom of movement. Triremes were not ships on which one could actually live. They tended to be moored every night and ideally drawn up on the land. And they couldn't move very far in any particular day. They relied where possible on sail, but obviously in battle they relied very much on oarsmen, and the amount of energy required, the amount of effort required to navigate a trireme in a battle would have been really extremely exhausting.
Each trireme was manned with a combination of slaves and free men, all of whom were paid for their services aboard ship. The conditions below decks were cramped and squalid, little better than any other navy. But nevertheless, Athens created a proficient and powerful navy. Any slave who rode in the Battle of Salamis and survived the bitter combat was given his freedom at the close of the war. The Spartan land army delivered the final crushing blow to the Persians at the Battle of Plataea, and the Greeks were free to fight amongst themselves. With their newfound freedom from the Persians, 5th century Athens and Sparta were rich and prosperous. Art, literature, religion, and philosophy flourished. Athens and Sparta grew stronger. Athens remains especially important to the modern world because of all the institutions it formed the basis of and left to us. We all know about the magnificent buildings, the art, and the poetry and prose. But what of the theater, education, philosophy, and, most importantly, democracy?
Poets and playwrights after Homer have always been fascinated by ancient Greece and the tale of Troy, the Iliad, and Odysseus' wanderings, and of course Helen of Troy. She is the very epitome of female beauty. She comes into so many of the plays, particularly in the Elizabethan eras, and you can come right the way down to modern playwrights. It's curious how we in the modern world are the inheritors of a world of over 3,000 years ago, and in many instances we don't understand it.
This is the theater at Epidaurus. The stage was made of wood and has not survived. But the circle, called the orchestra, where the chorus used to perform, still remains. So too do the seats. It is not too difficult to imagine the stone seats filled with people, excited about the prospect of the plays they were about to witness. Traditional Greek plays are still occasionally staged for modern audiences to enjoy. It was an occasion for all the family, even the slaves. The theater would be open for 3 consecutive days for selective festivals during the year. Each day, 3 tragedies and a comedy were performed and judged compared with others in its genre. The audience and their cushions would stay all day and make up their own minds as to which plays were the best. Because of the importance of the event, those who were too poor to afford a ticket were given one by the state. Tragedians such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides changed the form of the play. They introduced a new aspect known as actors. The maximum number of actors in a play was 3, but 3 actors could play many more characters, and so the number of characters in the plays increased. Art imitated life in ancient times, just as it has done all through the ages. But none were so blatant as the satirical plays of the comedian Aristophanes. Athens was the first state to have a political system where the citizens voted for their head of state, a democracy. As with other political systems of the time, the politicians were corrupt. Policies were promised, but then the promises were broken. And with clever rhetoric, many of the public were fooled easily. Aristophanes saw through the fancy rhetoric, and he wrote plays which mocked the politicians and the government. Democracy was different then to the way it is now, but that is largely due to the fact that it was responsible for fewer citizens. An assembly was held once a week in order for the politicians to voice their policies. Male citizens were obliged to attend and received a small amount of money, provided they weren't late. Whatever the faults of this ancient democracy of over 2,000 years ago, it laid the foundations for the system of democracy that we have today.
The gods kissed it, from Zeus or any of our gods. God Almighty kissed that wonderful state. There it was, you walk in Athens, you could talk to the Prime Minister, you might say. You could talk to the king, a carpenter could talk to him. You could argue with him if you didn't agree with him. Democracy introduced by Solon. There was Socrates, there was Sophocles, there was Aristotle walking about the streets. Hello, Aristotle. You could talk to him. There was no class. You could talk. A democracy.
Ancient Greece was the home of some of the greatest philosophers and mathematicians ever to have lived. Parts of their work have survived and are relevant to today's society. The phenomenal philosopher and mathematician Pythagoras, who bequeathed the mathematical equation, in a right-angled triangle, the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the other two sides, also gave us the word philosopher, meaning lover of wisdom, to describe all those whose life was dedicated to the continual search for knowledge and truth. The freedom which democracy brought to society gave rise to such schools of thought as the Sophists, the Stoics, and the ideas of philosophers such as Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato.
Aristotle held a view of the universe, for example, which was essentially a Ptolemaic view. That is to say, he believed that the Earth was at the centre of the universe and was stationary, and that the fixed stars and the planets were fixed to crystalline spheres or something of that sort, radiating from the centre, which was the Earth. One of the other things that Aristotle claimed as part of his theory of the universe was that all heavenly bodies are perfect spheres and must be perfect spheres, because that's part of his overall physical view of the universe and how it's composed.
Plato, writing in the 4th century BC, believed in a republic where there is equality between men and women, and every citizen is equal to every other citizen. Plato develops the idea of education in his works. He introduces higher education to his students. General education in Greece had to be paid for. Therefore, it was usually only the wealthy children who would be thoroughly educated. Girls were taught weaving, sewing, and other household skills by their mothers and servants in the house, while the boys went to school. There they learned music, reading, and writing.
Most boys were probably educated more or less entirely by their fathers. The poorer people wouldn't need to know how to read. They probably would spend most of their life engaged in farming, and they would know what was necessary for doing that. But for the rich, who would have ambitions to take part in the political life of the cities, one would actually have more formal education, either by a private tutor, but probably mostly in actual schools, buildings specially built for education. kind of thing that they would need to know, apart from being able to read and write, would probably be the ability to speak in public, play a musical instrument, learn to sing, and probably to compose poems. Because a lot of the life of the rich would revolve around symposia, drinking parties when they would meet, and when perhaps a lot of the political things would be discussed. Beyond that, the other things that would be necessary would probably be physical. You'd expect boys to be trained in how to fight and also in how to take part in athletics. So you would have quite a lot of physical training taking place in gymnasia, and these seemed also to have been social meeting places. On the whole, the Greek educational idea, at least for the elite, doesn't make much distinction between physical and intellectual education. So it's actually quite difficult to draw a clear distinction between what might count as education and what might count as training or even as pleasure.
A far more important part of every male's education was at the gymnasium. Boys would learn to wrestle, box, run, high jump, and discus. They could bathe, relax, and talk about the things that they had learned. Even when schooling had ended, the young males still attended the gymnasium well into manhood. The best athletes from each state would then have to compete at the games. Every boy in the whole of Greece wanted to win a prize at the Olympic Games. Winning at the Games was not financially rewarding. Glory was the ultimate prize. The winner had a statue made of himself with his name and his favorite event engraved on the base. Games were an integral part of Greek society because of their strong association with the gods. There were many different games dedicated to different gods, but the Olympic Games were the ultimate. It remains that to win at the contemporary Olympic Games is the highest sporting achievement.
In mid-Greece, there's Olympia. It's not very large. To think that the Olympic Games were founded on such a very small area. The games would be known as the Hellenic Games, which was mainly wrestling and boxing and throwing the spear, javelin, etc. What was absolutely fascinating was that it was very pure. Thousands and thousands of people came from all over the place, from Thrace and Macedonia, from Asia Minor. They came across. In the half mile, or 880 yards, you might say, the 100 yards, 200 yards, they wore armour. When they didn't wear armour, when they wrestled, when they threw the spear, and when they boxed naked. Towards the 6th century, I suppose, BC, then it really started to kind of really become corrupt. People started to work and specialise on their figures, make their figures too big. The Greek figure was always of a certain beautifully proportion. And the Spartans were absolutely furious that the purity of the games, which would mainly come from their inspiration, was now being polluted. And they were the first to pull out, the Spartans. And once the Spartans pulled out, then the games really degenerated and really died out until, of course, they started again in modern time.
Mount Olympus was the home of the Greek gods, which meant that the Olympic Games were the games of the gods, and religion was taken very seriously. Zeus, patron of the Olympic Games, was the king of the gods, and his wife and sister, Hera, was their queen. His extended family made up the kingdom of the gods, each representing one or more aspects of society. For instance, Ares was the god of war, and Aphrodite was the goddess of love. Athens was the city of Athene, goddess of wisdom. The Greeks believed that she had given it her name, and the Athenians worshipped her above all other gods. They largely attributed the size and power of their glorious empire to her unbridled support. None of the gods were to be ignored or favored over any of the others, but if a citizen's life was lacking in love, for example, then a special prayer or sacrifice to Aphrodite would be deemed appropriate.
The average Greek would know the stories of Homer's gods and goddesses as they're told in the Iliad and the Odyssey. This doesn't mean that the gods and goddesses and the way they behaved in the Iliad and the Odyssey were necessarily seen as role models. They behave very badly. They have all sorts of human failings. Gods and goddesses in the Greek world were not seen as role models in that sense. So therefore it was perfectly all right for gods who behaved extremely badly, Zeus who abuses his power, Hera who behaves extremely badly as a wife, for instance, to be the patron gods and goddesses of certain institutions. Aphrodite, for instance, who is a known adulteress in Homer's stories, is still associated very much with marriage.
Cities, towns, villages, and homes were filled with temples, monuments, statues, and shrines dedicated to the gods. Famous tales which involved the gods were depicted in the reliefs that decorated the temples and the vases that the ordinary citizens used from day to day. The most impressive relief carvings appeared on the Pantheon. They were larger than life, boldly colored, and precisely sculpted. Gods other than Athene and Zeus had special places of worship. Apollo, god of medicine and the future, was worshipped through the oracle at Delphi. People would travel many miles to have their futures told to them by the Delphic priests of Apollo.
It's like the center of the earth at Delphi. Oh, you feel this kind of sound in the cave with blue butterflies all flying around it, where the oracle was situated, which said, of course, know thyself.
Having paid their money, the hapless believer would be drugged, led into a small darkened room, and left entirely alone. Here they would wait for an apparition or a sign, anything that could be construed as pertaining to their life. Satisfied that they had been given a message, they would return to their homes to decipher the oracle. The priests would then wheel in the next believer. From the ruins that remain, archaeologists can see that the rooms where the customers sat have many doorways, and there are a series of passages which run behind the rooms. The passages were for the express purpose of special effects. The room would fill with smoke, and a priest would appear through a secret door to deliver the riddle of the future. Apollo stayed on Mount Olympus, passing the messages through his priests. The only gods who did not live on Mount Olympus were Hades and Persephone, his wife, who lived in the murky depths of the underworld. Greeks believed that after death, the soul traveled to the underworld to be judged. Each soul had to pay Charon, the ferryman, to take them across the river Styx. This meant that there were certain obligations that the living family and friends had to the dead. Most importantly, the earthly body must be buried with a coin. If the body was not buried with the coin, then the soul could not cross the river. And likewise, if the soul had no coin, he could not pay Charon to take his soul into the kingdom of Hades. Failure to cross the river Styx meant that the soul would be in eternal unrest. Some souls would drink from the river of forgetfulness and be reincarnated, but the majority of souls stayed in the underworld forever.
We know quite a lot about Greek burial rites. We cannot assume that poor citizens did exactly the same sort of thing. We do know how the wealthy buried their dead. There was a particular process that you went through. There was a laying out within the entrance of the household. The women of the households, particularly women's work, were to wash down the body, wrap it in a winding sheet, and lay it out. And then people came to see it. The women mourned publicly. They tore their hair, scratched their cheeks, set up a keening The next part of the process was the funeral procession from the household to the graveyard. Graveyards were always outside the inhabited area of the city, usually outside the city walls. So you walk through the city. The procession was led by the women. The body was either carried or on a cart. We know this from vase paintings. And the men followed the body, followed by flute players. It was quite an extravagant performance. Children who died in infancy were often buried within the confines of the house or by the hearthstone. These are the only people who are buried inside the city or inside the oikos, if you like. Unfortunately, we have very few remains because babies' bones tend to be very friable and don't exist in the archaeological record. Apart from that, everybody was buried outside the city. As to whether poor people were buried in a different way, they were highly likely to be buried with much less pomp and circumstance. A lot of the laws that come through in Athens and other Greek states are actually controlling the amount of expenditure people were making on their burials because it could become part of a political statement. So in fact, by the time we get to the mid-5th century BC, people are beginning to control the amount of noise you can make while bringing your cortege through the city.
It is difficult for people in the modern world to imagine how fundamentally important the role of religion was in the life of the ordinary citizen. The flamboyant anthropomorphic gods, entirely plausible to the ancient Greeks, have become contemporary fairy tales and legends. Other ancient civilizations have given us literature, buildings, philosophy, pottery, and statues, but nowhere has given us such an enchanting and extensive supply.
The most fascinating thing about Greece is the fact that we're still influenced by it today. We are influenced by its way of thinking about democracy, about state formation, by its art and architecture, which we still see around us today, its idea of ideal and model beauty, particularly by its philosophical thinking, by the idea of ideas, if you like.
There are mountains of fantastic plays, artwork, and life that are buried for all time with the Athenian Empire. But we are privileged to have enough access to their knowledge to create a wonderful picture of life in ancient Greece. Its glory lives on.